Well, hi everybody. This is Merle Robinson, and I'm here to do a presentation on the conversion of games to online, and I'll talk about the journey taken by my national security decision-making team in that process. You're going to see during most of this presentation, I'm going to have just the slides up rather than me next to the slides because I have a lot of detail and we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to kick that off pretty quickly. So let's go to the next slide and we'll go to full screen. There we go. All right. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a retired DoD analyst, a Lean Six Sigma black belt, and I'm the lead designer for National Security Decision Making Game. I'm also the outreach director for Connections USA and one of the co-founders with Chris of Connections Online. And what I do in my retirement, because I'm a retired civil servant, is I spend my time looking at systems and organizational dynamics and decision-making processes and so on. I've led a tremendous number of events over the years because we do our events at public and private venues. So that's the thing. So where we're going today is we're going to talk about examining the problem of managing large multiplayer online war games. And I'm going to talk first about our example, which is the national security decision-making game, which I'm heavily involved in. And that basically covers a lot of the same kinds of issues that other professionals see when they deal with large games. And when I talk large, it's at least 20 and sometimes up to 200. And generally, when we run our events, we run events for 80 to 100 people very commonly, even though we've run some smaller and some larger. So not only are we going to talk about that example, we're going to talk about the kinds of requirements and constraints that are involved with making that conversion and the kinds of things that we encountered with our group. I'm also going to talk about things that we looked at as part of the research process. And that's part of the reason I'm doing the presentation, because Chris had noted in our process when I talked with him, when I started this about 3 years ago, that we were a little more systematic than a lot of folks, and we had a lot of the same kind of issues that most of the professionals have. So what I'm trying to do is sort of give you the ombudsman's view of the things that we looked at and the high points of good and bad. And then I'll talk about what our solution was and the kinds of compromises we had to make because we moved everything online. So a couple of caveats with this process. First of all, this is a serious overview, but it's not definitive. The level of research on particular items has varied a little bit. Most of the work was done about 3 years ago, and I keep doing some rechecks, and I did a lot of rechecks for this presentation. We're still looking for better options, and I want your feedback to find better solutions, both here and in Discord. Lots of creative people are active out there, and the tools are evolving. So what I really want to see is if you've seen something that we have not. Now, unlike most of our presentations where the views are those of the participants, not their employers, I'm currently retired, so they are my opinions. So you can consider it that way. So the next thing that we're going to start talking about is our example. The National Security Decision-Making Game is a nonprofit educational group, and we're made up of 100% volunteers. That means people work when they want to work, and we schedule around that. We have a core of about a half a dozen really dedicated people and about 50 volunteers. And at most of our public events where we run games in the 100-person sort of size group, we normally have about 8 to 10 staffers. And we regularly appear annually at the 3 big hobby conventions in the United States, Origins, Gen Con, and Dragon Con. And we occasionally appear at professional venues like National Defense University or WinSec. Or we did an event several years ago for the Marine Corps intelligence activity. We also do colleges, and we just recently did another high school. We were out at Culver Academies in Indiana and did an event for about 15% of their student body. And we're really all about trying to understand how decisions are made and to share things that we learned along the way. So what that basically means is we're running games and we're doing presentations. And what we try to do with our games is provide synthetic experience that represents the dynamics of real world decision making. So people get exposed to how things really work in the modern world. NSDM's background is it was founded in 1990 by 2 brothers, both of which worked at the Naval War College. One was a class instructor, one was part of the Wargaming department, which is the second being Mark McDonough, who's still with us. And they were asked to demonstrate professional games at Origins and Dragon Con, which were a common event in 1990. And over the years, we've added collaborators, both professional and hobbyists, and added more wargaming, military, and technology lectures. We basically have created a niche for professionally researched large multiplayer real-world games on a variety of topics, and you can see the list. So what is our niche? Well, our games are developed using a professional analytical technique, and we employ the professional and some hobby techniques for public use, because we've added what I normally talk about as game tech. We have people who are experienced role players, experienced storytellers, and that helps the process. So we have a formal structure, we have a trained staff, we have designated roles, we have guides and rules, and we have expert adjudication. That's really the killer for us, is expert adjudication, because all the areas that we simulate or run games on are things we've done significant research on and can sort of live and breathe that. We don't have to go pull a reference. All our games are designed to see that players have agency, and the general structure of our games looks a lot like most professional games. We have a way that demonstrates and distributes news and information that's public kinds of things, like our world news feed. We have map projections, and we've got an IT system that does that. You'll see a view of that later. We have a military controller and sometimes an economic controller that sees that all those things have a unified approach. We have a game director, which watches the pace, deals with ensuring that people are busy enough and not too busy. And we also have facilitators that represent all the rest of the world. What the players do is represent factions within nation states, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The other thing that we do that most groups do not is we have a high ability to adapt to our audience. So depending on the venue we're in, you'll go from stark reality and very close adherence to historical events to a little bit more fanciful. So the kind of game we run at Dragon Con, which is a science fiction convention, is a lot different than the kind of game we'll run at a professional event. We use the same kind of processes to evaluate all the components that you all do in your professional work. And I'm not going to go into the details of PMISI PT as a model, but essentially we have a couple of learning objectives that we want to accomplish for all the people that go through the games. We want them to experience a historical-like or real-like environment with a goal to inspire a desire to learn more, to understand decision-making, and to get insight on domestic and international relationships. And normally what we talk about are 4 areas of interest. We talk about, let me go back a slide there. We talk about cultural circumstance, choice, and consequence. And that also means that we integrate things like the traditional instruments of national power that's normally with the dime model that you often see. Other things that are important here is when we talk about culture, circumstance, choice, and consequences, one of the things we recognize is we don't do a particularly good job on culture because we generally have a bunch of Americans playing a game about some other country. So there's thousands of years of written history, an entire educational system that people go through of different family relationships, but we do give them some insight into some of the basics because we will give some briefing information in the course of play. They'll get what I call the 1-minute teaching moment where we'll share something that we've learned along the way. Then we deal with circumstances and the choices connected to those. So we're really good at those 2 things because essentially what that is, all right, I have so many forces to do something. I have so much economic clout. I have so much political clout. What are the things that I could choose to do? And then after you make that choice, we generate what we attempt to have as real world type consequences. And we do that all in 2, 4, and 8-hour doses. So what you see is that the level of sophistication increases the longer the games run. They're designed so that short games tend to be executive level and dealing with international relationships. 4-hour and 8-hour games get to do more precise stuff. 8-hour games do a lot more economics. And the structure of our game is pretty straightforward. We describe how the game works. We give people a world background. If we have it at public events, we normally warn people about the veterans because we have people who played over 50 games. And then we release them into the national processes they have and have a cell controller manage their elections or their fake elections or whatever is appropriate. And at the end, we do an AAR, just like most professional events. We talk about why did you do that crazy thing? So our staff structure mirrors in many ways what you see at other professional events. We have a game director, military and economic controllers, facilitators that represent all of the nations and groups not represented by the players. We have a country national cell controller, for each country that we play. And then, of course, we have the players that make the whole thing fun. And what that also means is that for us to run games like that, we generally need 5 basic people to fill roles, and that grows to 10 or so folks for 130 participants. The more staff we have, generally the higher quality the game can be and the more detail that people can be exposed to, but that can vary as well with the environment. What people do in our game is they represent cones of supporters that pursue their own goals. They're basically real world kinds of factions, like you might be a faction of the Democratic Party, you might be a bureaucrat, and those are all positions that have been designed based on our analysis of how the countries operate and what the significant organizations are that can affect change in those countries. So this is an example of what players get, and we basically jumpstart them with these nice little cards, and they're postcard size. And on the front, it has all the public things and the sign symbols and tokens of what they're representing and who they are working with. And then the back side shows all their secrets. Like, for example, this particular one is a card that we played once with a 9-year-old because it was meant to be a demo, and it's the person in charge of promoting cricket in Pakistan. And their secret power is they can get tickets to any cricket game in the world. And of course, you don't want everybody to know that, or they'll be knocking on your door. So that's why we tell them to keep that secret. To make things happen in our game works a lot like the real world. Essentially, you come up with an idea or plan, you gather resources, time passes, and the staff gives you a result. Very straightforward process. And how we manage that is with what we call action sheets. Action sheets have them write their simple plan on the back, like, for example, build an interstate highway system in the United States in the 60s. And then on the front side, it has all of the foreign groups and all of the internal groups and the staff approvals for what they need to get things done. Generally, we help the players size that. And if the players are struggling for an action, we'll say, okay, we're your staff as well, and ask your staff says, these are the top 3 things that are on the plate in your country. Do you want to do one of those or something else? And here's a good example of how the plans can work, and they're also a lot of fun. So this is our map tool that we have that shows people current news, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that later. This is another example of the kind of precision that we can get. You see that it shows military counters, it shows circular range circles. It'll tell you how far you can fire something. There are lots of things that we can do with this, and this is an open source tool, so we've been very happy with it. We also have play aids that tell people for the countries that they're in how those things work, and this is a sample. This is what a game looks like. Basically a bunch of people wandering around that we put in different areas of the group or different meeting rooms and manage it just like a professional game. There are certain things that come out of groups and certain things that come out of individuals. So if you want to contact NSDM, generally right now we have 3 ways: Facebook, YouTube, and email, because we've got our website under construction. So that's the NSDM part. And I want to pause here for a second to see if anybody has a question about NSDM, because I can do these now rather than at the end of the game or end of the presentation. And then we'll start moving into requirements and constraints. All right, I don't see any questions now, so I'm going to press onward. So the next section that we've wanted to talk about is the requirements and constraints of trying to convert to online. And essentially, the big thing is to first figure out what your requirements are. Things that are requirements are things that impact your objectives, affect the features that you get to use, and affect the labor and the time that you have to get things done. So the second thing is users. What do I need to use for the users in terms of hardware or software? Because that's particularly important for online. And what do they need to learn and how hard that is? Also the product. What does it need to run? Are there potential problems with connectivity or platforms? And what kinds of things do we have to do in terms of the transition? How do we learn it? How do we teach it? How do we make it easy to use? Okay, so what are the kinds of things that we looked at? Well, we looked at features that we aren't using right now that could simulate reality. And what I tried to do here was to show you with the red, green, and yellow and purple blocks, sort of how we sort of prioritize the things that were requirements and the things that were nice to have and the things that were have to have. And we're going to talk briefly about all those things in some form here in just a minute. So the other thing is what's your constraints? Because one of the things that comes up when you move to online is there are lots of potential issues because you have whole work stacks of things that you have to get done. One of the key things is, what do you have to do to retrain your staff? Because you got a whole new set of tools. You can't just take your physical tools and try to replicate them exactly online. And what kind of setup do you need to have in terms of preparation? Does it take a while to build your structure? Does it take a while to build new aids? What are the processes that you're going to use for that? What do you have to do to train the audience? Because when you run a game, you have an end brief or a rule set that you pass out. And we do that in our live games live. It takes about 15 minutes in a 4-hour game to explain how the rules work to somebody who has never participated in a game before. But if you're doing it online, can you send it to them in advance? Do you have to do it as part of the process? What form does it need to take? Can you deal with people who have handicaps? Because when we do live events, we've had people who are legally blind be in the game, and we've made accommodations for that. We've had younger people come to the game that needed more coaching. Basically what you have to be doing is evaluating your showstoppers. That's the other part of that process. What can derail anything else that you're doing? And then when you're talking about other things, because first we talk about time and what's required to run the game and set up the game. The second thing is cost. And always there's the decision about whether you build or buy your new tool. How much it's going to cost. So one of the real constraints that hits the National Security Decision-Making Group is we're all self-funded. And until just the last couple of years, we didn't even charge a cost for our events at conventions. We were a free event. We recently had to change that because of the expense of going to cons. So we have built a very small kitty, but our total revenue in a year is under $5,000 because we're not trying to make money. And what that basically means is we don't have $100,000 to do a software contract or to pay by user fees that are $100 a person per seat or things like that. So that has an impact on the kinds of things we're going to talk about as we move through the presentation. Also, you're going to see that we're talking about scope. We need to talk about what are essential features and what are nice to have. And if you have a nice to have that's free, you've got to decide again what the impact of that is on time and quality. So the other thing with quality is the last thing that I want to talk about, because after you take into account time, cost, and scope, quality is going to be your result. And the question is, how easy is it to use for the staff and the players? And are there things that affect quality because it's online, like bandwidth and processing, which is always a challenge. So the smaller the bandwidth you have, generally the less video, generally the less animation, the better off you are. So these are some of the joys of being a nonprofit. We have very limited staff hours. We probably get about 10,000 hours outside of conventions if we're lucky from all of our staff. Also, cost is an issue. We knew that this had to be cheap, under $500 a year if we were self-funded. Free is even better, but that's hard to come by. And then, of course, scope, the real issue, we got triggered into this just like everybody else with COVID. We needed to try to have an initial product in about 3 months. So it was like, how do you field that? What tools are available? How do you get that? And you add the essentials later, because essentially it's a building block process. You do the first major things that handle your core processes, and then you move on to the next stuff. So the other thing that is a joy of nonprofits is remote user constraints. And some of this really relates to all your professional events again. One is the requirements for the user. What is it, classified or unclassified? If it's classified, that's an issue. If it's run on a military base, that's an issue. Hardware and software requirements. Can you run it with a basic like Chrome machine or an Android tablet, or do you have to run it on Windows or Apple products? What's the operating system? Are there firewalls involved or antivirus problems? Because there's some applications that if you have an antivirus in place, you've got to do special things to give it your application permission to get in. And bandwidth, whether that's a problem, particularly if it's free, because there are some things, if it's not text-based, you start having delays. And we've heard people talk earlier in this session about using shared Google Spaces, where they had messages that they couldn't operate in real time because there was more demand on the system than there was capability. Also, the question is, of course, is extra training, both for the users and the staff. What can be done as self-training, and what are the minimum supplements you have to make to game rules for people to know what's going on? So as we start talking about requirements, the big requirement is communications. That's one of the things that changes dramatically when you move online. So what we tried to do for our game was to figure out what were essential for people to be able to do. Because for practical purposes, we had information sharing processes, we had action processes for the players that we would adjudicate, and then there was all the communication. And because of the way we handle that game with separate spaces and areas in physical environments, there were a lot of issues. One was we needed to see that all players could see things like the game rules brief or PowerPoint slide decks that provided additional information about the nations or the process they were involved in. They needed to see all the active player roles, because when you're at live events, everybody has one of these cards that they put on their chest and it says, I am so-and-so. And you can see that just by walking around. You've got to have tables and mechanisms that people can do that in a practical way. They also, in our game, have to be able to initiate private conversations and private group discussions, because in an open environment, what happens? You go over and you see somebody who's got a role that you think you need to have a chat with, and you say, well, why don't all the foreign ministers get into one place? Let's go over to this corner and have a chat. That's easy in real life. It's hard when you're online. And individuals have to be able to see their personal information and motivations without anybody else being able to see that. Groups need to be able to see cell briefs and unique things for country news. So if they have their current military status, that's the kind of thing that they're going to want to hear about. Cell handouts and play aids. And of course, the staff have to be able to initiate or join in any conversation and have message groups for all the preset groups and classes. So if you're doing nations, if you're doing trade groups, if you're doing military members, you need to have some method to draw them all into the same information space so they get what they need. And when we talk about processes, our key process is action sheets, which means how do they initiate it? How do they route it? How do they get other people to see it? So you can get them to say, hey, that's a great idea to build that interstate highway system. I'll help with that. And then how do we adjudicate it and give those results to the players? So in the evaluation process, the kinds of things that we tried to look at was, can we get all the features we would like? Can we afford it? Can we learn it? Can our audience learn it? How long will it take? All those kinds of things. And what processes we might have to re-engineer, add, or abandon because of that possible. So one of the things we had kept hoping for was there was going to be the one solution, the one ring to bind them all, but we didn't think that was likely to happen. So the question was, how close can we come? So one of the things we didn't look at is our map tools, because you saw the map that I showed a little bit earlier. That's an open source product, and we figured out that we could either take screen captures and send a static image or show the dynamic with some kind of a video tool, regardless of how we did other things in an online environment. You can also see where that's available from the link that I provided. And we have a primary, expert, and multiple trained staff. So we built a sunk cost system now where we've done a lot of investment in seeing we have tokens and maps that are appropriate for all the areas. So again, these are the kinds of things that we looked at. And so now I started looking at particular tools and what they did. So I started looking at classes of things and trying to figure out which ones had applicability and what things they didn't have that we really needed. So one of the things we started looking at was RPG gaming, because there's lots of tools that do things for things like Dungeons and Dragons and those kinds of games. So essentially the nice things is they give you hosted space, they give you avatars, they give you maps, they give you an action order control, they give you group text and voice chat. But there are a couple of key problems that say that can't be your core tool. One is most of them have user count limits. Sometimes around a dozen is the cap. They also don't have voice and text breakout for more than the individual group and the GM. So there's 2 breakout areas, which means if you have 4 or 5 initiatives going on with different groups of 4 or 5 people in a 100-person game, they don't have a private chat area, which creates major problems. So then there are advanced things. Now, one of the advanced things that we looked at and we had familiarity with was this Infinity engine, which is used for Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Night kind of games. And it has some really nice advantages that really looked appealing in some ways, because basically your avatars have proximity-based view. So I could build a building that looks like the UN, with all the different side rooms and the main conference room, the General Assembly, and the Security Council. And if I'm in that room, I can see everybody that's in that room, but I don't see anybody that's outside that room. They also have proximity-based voice, so I can walk up to somebody and say, let's go look for the other foreign minister and have a private conversation, and we can walk in the simulation to another room. So it allows you to have real space simulation. It also has a programming community for modifications, and a lot of people run their systems for that elsewhere. So what you're going to see, and let me take this banner off so we get a clear view, is the big problems that kept us from using that as an option was you got to have a lot of programming skills. You got to host a server, which takes a lot of effort. You got to have issues with player counts, because anybody that's played that sees if you add more than 100 people, it lags a lot. All users need to have a licensed copy of the same software, which is the absolute killer for that kind of an application. So then we started looking, what was really good about that we might want to keep in mind. One was we could simulate real world spaces, and the other is we could do conceptual groupings or different kinds of graphics. So that was something we kept in mind. Then there's the board gaming tools like Vassal, Tabletopia, Tabletop Simulator. Those have some really nice things because they let you do maps and spaces and counters. That's kind of nice. And we could sort of simulate our map tools that way if we wanted to invest in it. It allows local instances, so you can run the game that's designed on your local machine, which really didn't apply to us, but it's kind of a nice feature. You can shift some things to email versus live play, and that generally works pretty well when you have people that are playing games with 1 to 5 or maybe even 10 people, because I'm not aware of any examples, not that they don't exist, of games with more than that number being ported into any one of these apps. So mostly speaking, the limit of players seems to be under 10. You got to have a lot of programming skills, although programming is a relative term. And there are a lot of community issues with mods because they're all little subsets. They're not just one big community. So then the other thing, obviously, was video meetings, because everybody looked at the video stage. I mean, we even ran a connections convention via Zoom in 2020, and we discovered some of the limitations that come with those kind of tools, whether it's Skype or Teams or Google Meet or Zoom or GoTo or Cisco Web. Most of them have a number of things about them that just don't answer the mail for everything. They could be part of the subset, but essentially they almost all deal with large one-way video. They do some of them, and GoToMeeting is one that seems to work a little better on this, is allow you to build subgroups and pick out 10 people and put them in their own space for a while and then bring them back. So you can do breakout group options, but they tend to be kind of cumbersome to set those up. So, video meeting software could be useful, but it's only part of the solution for us. And if we had a solution that had everything, that would be better. So that was part of our evaluation process as we moved along. Then there were document sharing tools. And this was really useful for a lot of things because you can have links and you can assist other options with these links. You can control access by users or groups, so we could identify the nations and factions that we look at in our game. And you can provide pictures, maps, slides, video, reference URLs, and all kinds of stuff. So it very clearly made it evident to us that this might be part of the solution. And basically the shortfall with it is you have to have precise access lists. So you have to have a way to put people in the access list and take them out of the access list. As we talked earlier, what that means is prep time. Prep time you do not have to do in a live game because people just walk around and grab somebody. The other thing is text and email tools, because you look at things like Twitter, which is now X, and other messaging tools like Meetup and all kinds of things. But essentially, those are really good for short messages or for a news feed. But we have a news feed tool that we kind of like. And special groups are possible, but the users have to follow those groups. And sometimes they have to download software, not always. We also looked at some whiteboard tools, because even though we don't traditionally use whiteboards in our live games, it does have some nice features. And that's something we may want to come back to in the future, because when you have some games, like our Cuban Missile Crisis game, where we have small country cells of about a dozen people in each of those countries dealing with things in a very confined time frame, because we cover the 13 days of the crisis, it might be nice for them to have the capability to use those kinds of things. And then, of course, we looked a little bit at classroom learning management systems. Gather's one that I saw that was kind of interesting, and I know there's some others that have this feature, but it basically is designed for schools. So every student has an avatar, and they can walk around the classroom and talk with other classmates by text and sometimes by voice, depending on how it's structured. So those seem to have a lot of potential, but they're also a really deep dive. So since we didn't see any free killer apps, because price was a big consideration for us, we didn't spend nearly as much time in that space as we might have. Let me take a quick look here. I see a couple of things. Okay, we'll come back to this. The other thing that I saw were our alternative reality tools. And this one really got me excited, and it's Second Life. Second Life has a lot of very cool features, but still had some constraints we couldn't stand for what we were doing. It's free access for basic. It has avatars. You interact with places, avatars, objects, and real property. You can actually buy space that you can redesign on this server to look like a UN building, like I talked about earlier. So it has the same kind of advantage that you saw from some of the high-end RPG stuff. And it manages to do stuff in 12 languages and has their own Linden dollar, which is an internal currency that's equivalent to real dollars. So you can buy things in-game, buy features and capabilities. The other thing is, there are real live organizations that are out there on Second Life. There are countries that run their real embassies and provide certain services, not necessarily all. There are universities, campuses that are there. There are companies that are there. It has a whole economy. So, I mean, this has definitely got a lot more things than we would need, but it has some really nice features in that you can model your space to look like the real space you would run your event in. You can have avatars that allow people to communicate by voice and by text that it simulates reality. They can interact with objects, and there are processes you can link. So like our action sheets could be programmed into this. That's pretty cool. But here come the drawbacks. One, you've got to use their client or a few alternative viewers. And again, you have to learn that steep learning curve on how to program and develop stuff. They also tried to replace Second Life with a thing called Sansar, which they're now looking for a buyer for. So it's not real clear how much Second Life is going to have a continued life, but they've still got about 800,000 users, which is a huge installed base. It is remarkable. And that really has a lot of potential, I think, for some professionals to look at if they have unclassified items. And, the shortfalls there obviously are proprietary shortfalls and workflows. I'd love to see somebody's case study on how they did a workflow, programming, and virtual real estate. But it's got huge potential and huge effort. But just to give an example of the kinds of places, the Mayo Clinic has a real clinic to answer questions and do presentations there in Second Life. It is remarkable the kinds of things that go on. Yes, Chris, Second Life might get a Second Life. That's cute. But then we started looking at things that have more combinations. So we looked at things with channels. Slack is one that I've heard Ed McGrady talk about. I don't have nearly as much experience with, but when I looked at the reviews about Slack and the features in Slack and Discord are very much the same. They have a lot of the same features in terms of groups and management and voice and text channels. When you look at the evaluations and the public reviews, Discord's pluses are things like price, ease of use, focus for casual users and gamers, where Slack has more features and, because you're paying a fee, has a lot more support. So if you've got a problem with something, you're going to get more direct help. Okay. So we've been going through this really fast because I thought I had an awful lot to cover, so I'm ahead of schedule. But, so basically our solution when we started looking at this was we were going to keep our map tools process because that allows us to do static or dynamic maps so that people can see military situations and country maps. Discord seemed to be the answer because it was cheap, because even if you add more bandwidth, there's a very reasonable fee, and you can run it on anything. One of its big advantages is it will run on all kinds of platforms. You can run it on your cell phone, you can run it on a tablet, you can run it on an Android tablet, you can run it on a Windows tablet, you can run it on an Apple tablet, you can run it on a desktop computer. All those things have lots of advantages. It's also something a fair number of gamers, and since we do a lot of our events at public gaming conventions, are already going to have some familiarity with. Does, however, mean you're still going to have some people you have to have remedial training for, or a way to direct to instruction before or during a session. So that has a huge impact on things as well, but not as bad as if you're dealing with a proprietary process with a high entry cost and a client that you got to load. So what were the real winning features? Well, there's free versions with no cost. There's no software download, multiple platforms, text, voice, and video. It'll handle large groups. It'll do hidden channels, which was a real plus because you can have a hidden channel for the staff and they can talk about how they're going to adjudicate an item. You've got repository links that you can put into documents, public free training resources, and an online community. Now, your mileage can vary because a lot of the folks that come to this convention have classified issues, firewall issues, or bandwidth issues, all of which drive processes. Okay. So essentially, one of the challenges that we got to as we started to figure out how to implement this was the balancing act of how we were going to replicate most tasks. So there's some things we found we couldn't do. But what essentials can we do? Well, we could do player training with their in-briefs, their text, their docs, and their video. We could do role and information control. We could do play aid access, and we could do our after-action debrief. That gets a little weird because if you got a 100-person game, it's hard to clearly have a flow of people in and out when they have questions and comments that's as dynamic as in a real world game, but you can actually manage it mostly kind of sort of. What areas become real problems? Well, we knew we were going to see problems with timely action sheet processing because often when we do that live, a controller from the United States cell, for example, will consult with the game master, consult with the MilCon and say, I'm looking at this and this is what I'm looking at giving them as the adjudication. Is there something else that impacts it? Well, you got to go to a separate space on the server to have that conversation. You can't just walk across the room and a half a dozen steps and ask it. Players have to monitor more resources because with channels, you have a lot more stuff. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. Also, you have to have a lot more oversight of game flow because there's so many different places people are communicating. And as a game director and a cell controller, you want to be as aware of those things as you can to monitor the actions they're doing, the discussions they're having. Because if you see what they're talking about 10 minutes from now, you're going to have a lot better idea of how to adjudicate it because you're going to know the other moving parts and the countervailing forces where people are doing things. There's also an issue with queue access. You rarely see that at a live convention or event, but you will see that particularly in online as we started to test this, where I've got 3 people that want to talk to the facilitator or the staffer that's doing the same job. And then you've got a wait queue. That creates some other issues that in a live event, you can pull somebody else over and say, he's going to act in this role for you for 5 minutes because there's 10 people in line. You add another person to the line. And when it's a general facilitation task, that works pretty well. When it's a specific facilitation task, like where is every military unit right now, you really have to have a queue where there's only one person doing it from a practical standpoint. So here's an example of how we ported one of our games to Discord. This is our Cuban Missile Crisis game. And with the Cuban Missile Crisis game, what we basically did was we set it up so it was limited in time and space. It's a 13-day period. We've got a much more heavily scripted background for injects that players can react to or be exposed to. And essentially what we built is there's a welcome space, a briefing space, a resource space, a help and tech space, all of which are naturally evident to players when you're going live. Because here's the badge, it says game director or MilCon or whatever, and now they've got a place they've got to go. If they need help, they can go to any staffer, but in this, they've got to go to a special area where a staffer picks it up. Your international and news feeds that everybody have to see have to be separate areas. So things that if I'm sitting at a desk and I'm doing the neck swivel from one side of the room to the other, I can see most of the things I need and who I need to go talk to and be there in seconds, where here it's a little bit more laborious. And then each particular nation cell in our games have their own specific areas. And you see in this example here, the United States. And then there's all their internal stuff that they have to do. The part you're seeing right now of the United States is their player aids, their conference desks, their conference rooms for their own folks, and where they send messages in and out. Because one of the unique things about that era in the 60s is how long it takes messages to move from country to country and the potential for other stuff. And I see we've got some questions, but I'll come back to those in a little bit because they seem like the kind of thing we can do at the end. So here's an example of the cells that are built out. And you'll notice what we had to do is build a private space for each and every person role-playing a faction or an individual in some cases. In Cuban Missile, it's basically a cabinet-based game for the Soviets, the Cubans, the Americans, and so on. Where in a regular contemporary or modern game, you'll have the Secretary of Defense, you'll have a particular political party, you have a particular faction of the bureaucracy, and those kinds of things will be different. Every player has to have a channel with their personal information. And those spaces, because in the channel tools will highlight when there's a message, become the conduit for players to talk directly with the staff in their role as staff advisor. So what we tell players in our game is we don't expect you to know everything about the military or everything about the politics of the country. So we're going to represent your staff and give you the same kind of answer we think your staff would give you. So if you're outer Baluchistan and you say how many missiles the United States has, we'll say a lot. And if you're the Soviet Union in the Cold War, we'll tell you 1,157 you think, So that kind of thing, you've got a management tool for. So that gives you that one-on-one space. Then what we have within those spaces also is the specific briefing for each individual on motivations or background. In the Cuban Missile Crisis game, that includes things like reference materials. So there's briefing stuff that shows them the range of different missile types, the kind of deployments they've got as a country, their economic relationships with other countries. And you can see in this one, this is JFK's. All right. So when we moved online, here are the things that we really learned. Everything that was easy is not easy online. We'd really discovered prep time goes way, way up. We have to do a lot of things with controls and permissions and structures that we wouldn't have to do in a regular game. It more than doubles the effort that we have to create to move forward. Now, after you've created the first one, if it's exactly like the last one, some of it's easier. So like our Cuban Missile Crisis game, we were able to build a template. And all the starting template stuff is there. We don't have to build it twice. But if we do something custom for a particular iteration or for a particular sponsor, we do have to put those modifications in and have a method to keep track of what's different with this iteration than another. So I have like 6 instances where we run the Cuban Missile Crisis game, and they all archive the text that people made and the kinds of questions they had and the background that we had, and they're all individual instances because that's the only way you can monitor that. The other thing that you'll discover is monitoring is harder. Because you've got to look in so many places to see what player activity is, management of the pace of the game is much more difficult for the game director or for the cell controllers. Live tracking of activity is a real challenge. And the one thing that you don't have is there's no good tool for tracking the voice conversations unless you actually go there and sit in. So like our Cuban Missile Crisis game is a great example. Each cabinet gets together and has a discussion. So your game director and your cell controllers need to be communicating on what kinds of things are in that discussion. Like they're talking about direct retaliation with intercontinental ballistic missiles, or they're talking about a marine invasion. And that tells you the kinds of things you might have as injects for intelligence sharing between organizations. Like, oh, the Soviets now have a clue something's going on, and you see that Marines are moving from point A to point B, but you don't know why. Those kinds of things. And that also means because it's voice, there's no typewritten record if you're trying to do professional analysis. That's not a problem for us in our games because we bring things out in the AAR where we ask people why you did that crazy thing. But if you're trying to do formal analysis to understand how and why a decision was made, the only thing you have in a channel tool is the text. The other thing is you have to spend a lot of effort to identify player roles and be able to make contact with players individually and to react to players. because you've got to see a tremendous amount of stuff. When you go back for a second and look at what we had with this, if I'm trying to track the cube and cell, and I'm the cell controller, I've got 8 or 9 places I have to watch. If I'm the game director, I may want to go into any conference room. So if the Soviets are having a conference, the Cubans are going to have a conference, do I pop in for 5 seconds, hear what the topic is, and pop out, or do I keep staying there and not know what's going on in the other section? Those are real challenges that you run into in that process. The other thing that you see is that you have to have greater staffing to keep the staff apprised and coordinate your injects. So the net result on staff impact is you stretch so you're thinner in every place, or you have to add more bodies. That is a huge impact, and I can't stress that enough. Unless you have a highly structured tool, you're going to have trouble. Now, the most critical issues in doing this conversion, as I see it from our experience, is the number of channels and points of communication. That is the number one thing over all other things, because if you have groups making decisions and inputting turns or actions, it's much easier to handle than if everybody is doing it. And one of the problems we have with our NSDM games is what I call the many-to-many relationship. Somebody can go to anybody else at any time and grab any other 2 people, 5 people, 7 people, and go off in a private group. So every single player will potentially send you an action. And the cycle of play in a 4-hour game is they'll get 4 to 6 and sometimes 8 actions coming that they participate in for each and every player, which means you're seeing a pace where you'll have a stack of 2 inches of these little postcard kind of things at the end of the game that you're trying to figure out what's going on and trying to figure out how you rate and rank if you're doing any kinds of rewards, recognition, or analysis. So the number of channels of incoming information or the ways players communicate with you are the number one drag on what you're doing online. The number 2 drag is being able to observe the separate operating groups, because depending on the amount of information that you need, if all you need is their turn submission, you're fine. Things will be pretty easy. But if what you want to see is the process that they used, or you want to see that they've considered all the things their staff advisors would tell them they should think about, because you want to be sure there are issues they're thinking about in your game, that's an issue. The last part is timely adjudication. If you have queues forming in the structure, you know it's something you need to consider redesign. The other things that you can do to mitigate this process is reduce the number of decision groups. In our case, nation cells. It will be very, very hard for us to run a full 100-person game with 4 countries as nation cells online. We have not yet done that. And the reason we've not yet done that is all the stuff you just saw is multiplied by 4. The other part of that creates a problem is when that's multiplied by 4, the things we just talked about, the things like channels of communication, become humongous relative to the number of staffers you've got. It means that going from, I can run a 100-person game with 8 people if I'm live, but if I'm online, I run a 100-person game with 5 countries, as opposed to 1 country with 100 people, I've got a big, big problem. Because now, instead of having a couple of dozen things, I've got dozens and dozens, maybe as many as 100. So reducing the number of comm channels is a big deal for big game. Centralizing and simplifying things like adjudication and player choices. We have a very open, unstructured process, but if I made it so that a player gets to say, you get to choose A, you get to choose B, you get to choose C, then adjudication gets much easier, but it really doesn't give them the same experience. That is a huge problem. The other thing I want to pitch before we come back and answer questions is please visit all our Connection affiliates. Everybody's doing stuff, and UK is coming up not too far in the future. And I just want to be sure we hit that. So now I'm going to come back. And let's see. This is probably the one to sit on, and we'll start answering questions. So Chris, are you asking me questions or you want me to grab them? Okay, let me just sort of work through these. Okay, so Chris made a comment about one of the reasons he doesn't like channels. You can see who's in it and nobody can sneak in. Well, in our game, that's kind of good because we don't want somebody to sneak into a session as a spy. Our groups are large enough in terms of there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in a faction that people represent. That allows them to deal with the fact they can't sneak in. Okay, so Tracy has a question about the old Empire game. Yeah, and basically we thought about looking at text, which eliminates so many of the features of what our game does that it was not manageable. Yeah, Second Life will get a second life. Yeah, and a lot of things we've discovered is Slack and Discord are very similar. It seems to me that the color choices and the visibility in Slack may be a bit better than Discord, because Discord focuses primarily on black and white unless you do other stuff. So, I mean, that's a full thing. And then, of course, there's the question, have we looked at everything? Well, heck no, we haven't looked at everything. There are lots of tools we haven't seen because there's so many people who have been active, especially with COVID. That's one of the reasons why I want you all to be very active, to share what you've seen on the Discord server so we can look at this. We may do a version 2.0 of this presentation at some point in the future, but the goal is to see that we have a good idea of what features they give us, what the pros and cons there are, and we can sort of filter, not just for us, but for you. Because the reason we did this presentation was, Chris says to me, well, you looked at this more systematically than a lot of folks, and a lot of people haven't got to look at it at all, and it seems like it would be really helpful. So what I've tried to do is give you that broad brush overview of here are the components and the pieces and how it fits together, and hopefully that will prove to be useful to you. Okay, coming back to questions. All right. There are a couple of things that we couldn't do in an in-person game that this lets us do. One thing about it is if you set up your game online ahead of time, you can have interaction with players before the game starts. So you can get better briefings if somebody's interested in it. If they have a particular plan they want to experiment with, whether it's a control staffer or whether it is an individual in the game, you have a chance to consider it and have a discussion about what do you think the pros and cons would be. That really makes a big difference. Related, what did you release that you could add because of the format? That's a really great question, because part of it is things are evolving. I mean, Discord has a lot of features. We started doing things with threads, and threads let you do subgroups. There are different kinds of things you can do with emojis if you really want to get crazy with it, or with pop-ups if somebody does a particular kind of action. So one of the things we haven't done, but which online really helps, is we haven't linked a selection set with either buttons or a selection set based on keywords or something else that you could run with an AI background. So like, for example, if somebody does a military attack on somebody, you could have a graphic pop up, or you could have a soundbite pop up, and that might help immersion in the game, which we don't do live because, again, it's overhead. I mean, the thing about online is you can build overhead ahead of time to be easy to operate for things that happen frequently. So if you know certain kinds of questions always come up, you can do that. Okay. I have not seen a transcription bot for Discord. There may be one, because now we're starting to see that with other tools. We've started to see that with StreamYard, which is what we use for video for this conference. That would really help if we've made that advancement for those folks doing professional analysis, because then you've got a full record of what people have been doing. I think one of the challenges would be how you make it active for every channel. You might have to set that up individually because of the granularity of those tools. But since I haven't seen it, it might be a lot easier than I think. Yes, we did think about breaking the game into smaller chunks. One of the things that we've done with at least 2 instances of our Cuban Missile Crisis game is we facilitated action from the other cells with only a couple of people. So they're doing executive kind of decisions that are response, not all the detailed debate that you would normally see within a cell. Because one of the things we try to accomplish in our games is to see that all aspects of an issue tend to come out in the dialogue with players. So we want to encourage those kinds of things. one of the things I do a lot is what I call the 1-minute teaching moment. If somebody's thinking about a particular kind of military operation and they're not thinking of a particular area, like they're not doing any air or they're not doing any naval, I'd have a staffer come to this. Well, you could try something in this vein. And then they start thinking about options they never had before. We often would have that in games with political crises for our modern games, especially when we had our former State Department guy working with us, because he could talk about, well, you could try to do a demarche, and you could try to offer this countervailing thing in negotiations, or those kinds of things were things you do better live, but you can do it online. Absolutely, post-conversation and evaluation forums help tremendously. We tend to do a lot less of that than I would like, because we tend to do public events with our stuff rather than professional. We're not doing a research game. We're doing a game that's focused on experiential learning and getting people exposed to cultures and situations they might not have thought of. That's why in our games, a lot of what we do deals with arc and thread and counterfactual events. We try to make them very plausible real world events. But for example, a Cuban Missile Crisis game, we might have the Russian submarine commander that in historical case was talked out of using a nuclear torpedo against an American carrier actually do that, and then let the players think through what things could be different and how they would handle those things. But you're exactly right. That's the kind of thing that would help us a lot with monitoring and with analysis post-game. And you're not the only one that came up with that idea. We've got David talked about a mini AAR farm too. We do most of our AAR with the verbal debriefs. So Aaron mentioned that online gives teams a sense of real-world distance from the events occurring halfway across the room, and that's exactly right. One of the things that we do see some issues with, and we work on primarily with our verbal in briefs, because we do that even in Discord. We don't just rely only on the paper, because we're trying to get them to think and feel like they're in the era. So if all they get is paper, immersion suffers. If you can make it personal and add story and give them a good narrative, they can be sucked into the magic circle so that they suspend disbelief for purposes of the game. Because one of the things we have to do with each and every game is deal with abstraction, because the world is very complex. And NSDM is probably one of the most complex games I've ever seen, because we try to include everything. We have a very unstructured environment on what you can act on or what you can choose to do. The framework we give players is the description of real world groups and what their public motivations are, and roughly what their public resources are. So, I mean, that's a big difference in terms of how that process works. So that's what we do that's fundamentally different than most folks, because we can handle approaches, concepts, alternatives that most government organizations can't. I mean, years ago, one of the issues was people couldn't talk about Russia as the enemy or the USSR, because that has policy implications if you're a government organization. We've never had those problems because we're not a government organization. So we've run through the questions list so far. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Oh, I need to move this way a little. Looks like we've run out. So I'd say we've finished, and we've managed to do it in about half the scheduled time. So that's sometimes useful. We've got another one coming. My plan is to check the minor variation problems I had with editing on this and put a PDF out on the Discord server at some point here this next week, so that everybody can see those charts, because I had a lot of eye charts, a lot of information to convey in a limited amount of time. So Chris, you had another question.
I'm just going to add myself in. That's the easiest way to do it. First of all, thank you, Merle, for being involved in Connections Online 2024 and presenting. Merle is, of course, one of the people who puts the conference on. So this, him actually giving a presentation during the conference is like 0.05% of the total amount of effort he put into this conference. The thing I think I'm at the point where I can now articulate a feeling I've been having over the course of the last, like, I don't know, 2 years when we've been having this conversation. Because as Merle said, I've been constantly saying, like, you guys have done more thinking about this than anybody else. And I've sort of watched the process happening in real time and sat in on some of those games and watched it all happen. And I think we're still at the point, we writ large, as gamers trying to do something distributed online, I think we're still at the point where we're thinking mostly in terms of the framework of taking something that we would do in person and converting it. We're taking something we do it as a board game and converting it, etc. And by way of analogy, in the early days of factories were tall. And the reason why they were tall is because there was a big steam engine in the basement that drove a shaft that went all the way up to the top of the factory, and you had belts coming off of that shaft to run all the equipment, right? And then electric power came in and they replaced that steam engine with a big electric motor. And then somebody said, how about small electric motors? At which point they stopped building tall factories. Like, you can't find a factory today that's a skyscraper, that's a tall building. They're all spread out because if you can move your electric motors, you move the electric motors around, it's much easier to not have to deal with the headache of elevators and moving parts all over and stuff like that. The vertical part, you paid a penalty for the vertical part. I feel like we're at the point where we've gotten really good with using our electric motor with that vertical shaft.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, we're at what I call we're right now in second generation automation. Okay.
Yeah,
I used to work in IT, and there's first generation automation, which is all I do is I take the original process and I punch it in. It's like I take my punch card that I used to do input with, and I have a screen that I type, and it looks like a punch card. And then there's second generation automation, which is I've got an easier to use form and a structure and a workflow that builds the next piece. But we're still imitating, for the most part, the processes that we did manually. And it's only certain places where we have that epiphany of what we can do different. Okay. So one of the things that we haven't done is the animation automation link and now the AI links. Those are just a couple of examples. They're not the whole universe. So for example, I could see in a channel-based tool, and that still has the limits of I'm using the channel-based tool as my model, that when somebody takes a specific action, I can trigger an animation or I can trigger a response. For example, if we were doing the Cuban Missile Crisis game, I could trigger a timer when they fire an ICBM, and it pops a video up on their screen, and it does a countdown in the background on how long it takes to go from Washington to Moscow. And then when it hits, I can drop an animation in. For immersion, that would be great. Or I could do something like, while you're waiting, here's the circular area of probability on that nuclear attack and probability of how many casualties there's going to be. And then they see the result. Those kinds of things you can automate or provide that you never could do before. Because I wouldn't stop a whole game to do a video on what this guy's result was with his Marines landing on the beach or whatever. But I could do a lot of granularity there. The problem, of course, is that everything is a trade-off. It's scope, time, cost to generate quality. And that's why I used the graphic that I did, because so often we talk about the three, pick two, or pick one. And it just picks much better how those three things come together. Because if I had unlimited staff, or I had Bill Gates as my backer, and he put me on the Gates Foundation thing, there's all kinds of things I could do. I mean, I've talked for years about NSDM, the Winnebago. We drive right onto the gaming floor and pull out the big projectors, and the screen comes down on the side of the van. But those are kinds of things that right now we're just starting to think about.
Yeah, but I'm a big believer in the fact that when push comes to shove, most of this is TTMP. It's tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? It's how you sort of think about it. And one of the things that you guys, when you're doing stuff in Discord, there is a fundamental feature of doing it in person that you have carried over to the Discord, and that may or may not be the right answer. I'm not trying to, I'm not being
Oh, I
critical of
agree.
you,
Absolutely. And we need
but
to
I'm
keep that in mind
noticing
all
that
the time, that maybe there's a better way to do it.
the number one thing that you've carried over though is it's synchronous, right? You're, instead of meeting in a room, you're meeting in a Discord server, right?
That's
And
true.
everybody sort of comes in at the same time. And you know, there's a lot of potential there for having, for instance, an NSDM game that maybe it still plays synchronously, but it plays for between 10 and noon on Saturdays for 2 months.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Or
we have talked about the possibility of doing sequential things like that, and we've experimented live. We've had some games that we ran at a convention where the 2 o'clock game, the result of the 2 o'clock game is the starting point of the 8 o'clock game. So, like,
yeah, I like
North
stuff.
Korea and South Korea fight, and the world goes to heck in a handbasket, and now you're in the
Well, and
second game where you're
I
dealing with the
think
consequences.
I think I've suggested to you the idea of having a game where having multiple games that were like in country cells where outside the country was all NPCs, and then you take the results of all of those games and do an international game with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's no reason we couldn't. I mean, there are some underlying assumptions in what we're doing now. One is that the game all happens at the same time. All the players are there at the same time. You're running and
Mhm.
adjudicating at the same time. All the staff is there at the same time. You're all looking at the same raw data, whether it's depicted in one form or another, they've got a subset or whatever. We haven't done turn-based. Turn-based is very hard for dealing with interaction between countries, but turn-based between countries with interaction live in a country would be doable. So, for example,
Yeah.
a country has a turn. Your initiative, your top 3 initiatives, play it like a matrix game. I'm going to expand my economy by selling more exports. I'm going to build a road and rail and air network and shipping network around the world. Okay. I'm going to try to suborn small third world countries by giving them loans and other incentives. Okay. That could be your initiatives. Okay. And that's what is the output of what the cell has done. And those things can be adjudicated later. So I could have this a US cell, a China cell, a Japan cell, all playing at different times, just within their country. They generate those outputs. We then adjudicate those outputs and come back 6 months later in game time. And now you're dealing with those issues. All of those
Yeah.
models would work.
Yeah, there's sliding timescales is something that you could use very well in a distributed game. That it's hard to do that in an online game.
Well,
Or
there is
in-person
one
game.
example of something else we've done, and this is where gamer tech comes in as I talked about this. When we were at National Defense University a number of years ago, they were very specific. As the sponsor, they wanted us to do a NATO game. And at that time, we had 2 workable NATO cells because strangely, these countries have elections and manage their own affairs. So if I'm doing a modern game, I can't use the model I built in 2012 for Turkey. I've got to have a new model, which is a lot of work. So at that time we had, France and Turkey, and we wanted to have a way for them to interact. So we built a crisis in the game with peacekeepers in Lebanon. I mean, this was more than a decade ago. Okay. So they basically wound up under siege by Hezbollah, and they had a couple of choices. One of the choices was they were right next to the border. They could drive into Israel. Another one is they could have landings on the beach. Another one, they could have helicopter extraction. 3, they could fight their way out. They could face the people down. They got all those kinds of choices like in real life. Well, the Turkish players said, I'm going to drive across the border. Problem done. And the French players wanted to debate it. Now, in the game, the learning process was going to be for them to have that discussion about the pros and cons. So we managed to start reducing what they got to talk about between the countries. Oh, they're dealing with an internal issue right now. Reduce the communication thread so that, we're talking about trade on this one thing, or we're talking about this. So we're halfway through the game and we start controlling this communication between the 2 cells. And they're not moving between the 2 cells in the normal way where they just pop from room to room, because we've got that under control. And in the last 4 hours, they wind up 6 months out of sync because we know what the Turks have just done is going to have certain ramifications, and we cue it into the debate if we need to. But we get to the end of the game and debrief, and they're going, "What? I've never seen that happen," because we had them 6 months apart in time. And that's the gamer tech, because we had enough skilled facilitators that knew how to control that communication channel and distort the world. So each one felt they were in a unique space and were moving forward in a natural way and had no clue. And then with the debrief, they went, "That's fantastic. We need to try that," because there are places it makes a real difference.
So here's another question for you. What, if anything, what influence has the distributed war game efforts that you've done? How has that fed back into the in-person games?
One of the things it's done is it's improved our play aids. It's improved a lot of our documentation for players. One of our challenges throughout,
because you had to write it down.
Well, that's part of it, but another part of it is we do 2, 4, and 8 hour games, and there's a whole story behind that. I mean, originally we did the 8 hour games, and that was the only thing they did. And then they realized that a lot of our games are in public events, and people don't have that attention span. So Dan, who's no longer with us, came up with the bright idea to promise to do a 2 hour game before we had any mechanics or process. So there was some dummy, that said, "I think I can do that." And we built a really simple framework, and over time, the things that we had in the 8 hour game drifted into the 2 hour game, and then we morphed into a 4 hour game because we weren't getting as many people for the 8 hour games, and we figured 4 is about what we could get out of people with their schedules. And as a result of that, the quality of the shorter games just went way up, and that's happened as well because of Discord, because there's things that we wrote down, and because we knew we had to focus, we got more volunteer hours, because this is one of the challenges of volunteer management.
Mm-hmm.
Our group has got 2 really addicted people, me and Mark, and then about another 6 people who are regular contributors. Like, we've got a guy who worked on the Indonesian cell with me because we just updated Indonesia. I got a guy who did South Korea for a number of years, and he came in with a new design every couple of years. I've got people who worked on the Cold War cells for the Soviet Union and the United States. I mean, I'm not the only designer, but I helped coach, and then some people are good on their own. But because of that, there are things that we've documented over here that we've brought in over here, and things that I'd still like to, because if we had more volunteer hours, the Cuban Missile Crisis games, I'd be going from, we've got manila folders that look like they're 60s with the little wire things, and what I do is I would replicate all the documents, because now we've got the big yellow book that has all the real Cuban Missile Crisis documents that they used and the stuff, so they would have a real Twix, that would show the message that went back and forth kind of thing, or you could edit the lines, because it helps immersion. There are lots of things in that regard that as you build a piece of the puzzle to a higher level of detail, then you can either use as it is or abstract to move it downstream. Because our real challenge in this whole process is there are parts of the experience you got out of an 8 hour game you no longer can get out of the shorter game. Because when we talk about designing a game, you have to talk about audience and time and capability. So I always worry about, I've got to be able to teach it and run it in 4 hours. So my in brief's got to be 15 minutes. And if I take more than 5 minutes to describe the specifics of a country to people after I've done that, I'm in trouble. Because how much game time is there? I've got a 20-minute debrief, a 15-minute in brief. They really get to play for about 90 minutes. And I got to let them go 10 minutes early. So really, it's more like 70 minutes. And if there's something really exciting going on, we'll try to end a little early so there's more time for the debrief. So it's like you keep compressing and compressing. So you have to have things, which is why we've moved to what I call the 1 minute teaching moment, which I tell you how it works when you first have it come up. I don't give you a document on it. I may pull one out, or I may say, this is what you have to do to make this happen. Or I have a play aid, because you saw the sample. I've got play aids like the one for Russia that we had that are there for about 6 or 7 things, and we'd like to do more of that, but it's your volunteers, how much time do they have?
Yeah.
So I mean, if I had my ideal and started saying I want to do this and this and this and this and this and this for every game, I'd probably have a third more content if they all looked the same right now, because I would have fleshed it out to that degree. Now, if I had a professional staff and an unlimited budget, like Mitch with his new expansion at the Marine Corps, I mean, 24 to 50 some guys is pretty cool. I'd love to do that, but he's got to do 20 games. Oh,
Yeah.
gee, let's see. I go to 3 big events and run about 6 games an event. I do about 20 games. Oh, yeah. Mine all have sort of the same model, where his have to vary based on research requirements and tactical requirements and theater requirements and all that kind of stuff.
And all the rest of
So
it.
I don't want to make it sound like it's really the same. It's not, but I can tease him, right? Especially if he's not here. So do we have any other audience questions? Because Chris and I could go on this a long time. And
I don't see any other audience questions at this point.
Okay. Well, it seems like we've almost hit the natural end then, unless there's something else you think that we've talked about that you want to be sure I bring out for everybody.
No, I can't think of anything. Like I said, or when I urged you to volunteer to do this, I think you guys have done a lot of thinking about this, and you've encountered a lot of interesting problems. And I think there's still some. I still think we're at the point where the right answer is to sort of think about, okay, what if I were doing this sui generis? What if I wasn't trying to convert something that already existed?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think this is a work in progress, because not only do we need to think about redesigning the process around the tools are evolving. I mean, if I really had the opportunity, I'd love to do a lot of this stuff in Second Life, because that just has a real appeal to me. But that means that I either have to give everybody the PC or whatever they're going to run it on, or be sure that they all are on our public network and that they all can have the capability. Because I mean, right now, the nice thing about what we're doing is the minimum requirements for operating the system are almost nothing. Everybody can meet a Discord requirement. Linked documents mean there's very low impact. Bandwidth is not a problem. There are lots of issues that right now aren't difficult and aren't showstoppers. But the minute I move to something that's higher visual quality, more features, more real workflows, all those require some kind of a footprint on their machine or a server in the background that's going to operate all those moving parts.
Well, the heyday of Second Life, hopefully it'll have a renaissance. The heyday of Second Life was, what, 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, absolutely, because they had like 2 million people.
Yeah.
And the other issue is there's other alternatives. It's like,
well, what I was going to say is you don't necessarily have to think about how do you get your players onto Second Life. It may be Second Life is a place where you can recruit new players, or you say we're going to play in Second Life. We're just going to play it We're just going to play it in Second Life on this weekend. So get a Second Life account and join me in Second Life.
Well, the issue there again is you got to build all the stuff around making it work. I mean, we periodically get approached by lots of people at conventions, and one of the guys that worked with a company called Inferno wanted to try to put us online. And it seemed like a really interesting idea, but, he really didn't have the jets within his own company, even though he came and was a regular for a couple of years, because there's a lot of work to get there. I mean, they basically had a gaming platform like the Baldur's Gate Infinity Engine kind of thing, where they said, why don't we build a model and we can make this a prototype, and this would be a great way to develop our skills. And, essentially what we've seen in this whole movement to online has helped us get better. And honestly, you asking me to do this presentation helped me get better, because I was working on this 15 minutes before I came in with a couple of slides to be clearer. And it's like my thinking has gotten clearer and more precise as I've thought about the implications and had to be able to explain it to someone else. I find that is the main reason I do new cells in NSDM too, is it's like there's something I'm interested in and I get the bug. Indonesia is a great example, because the first Indonesian cell was in 2012, and no one in the team thought it was a country anybody would want to play. And I'm going, yeah, it is. You know why? If you're a military player, a third of your budget doesn't come from the government. You're in a country that's a new democracy. You've got essentially the army runs the government. And the political parties are Chrome. It's like, it's a gamer's paradise. Gamers would
Yeah,
love that
it really is.
because they have so many options. Now, today, there's a more structured system. There are oligarchs that have levers of power. There are things that are done publicly versus privately. It's a much more complex and rich world. And another part of it is now we have lots more information in English to do the research to build a good simulation of the country. I mean, I remember when I first started playing NSDM back in the ancient days of yore, okay? And the model for India was Gandhi and Sheikh bodyguards and a couple of factions, because that's all the more information most Americans had available. And it was a terribly built cell. I would argue that at the time when I saw it, because it's like there's not enough moving parts. There aren't enough real. There you've got like it's the difference between hardwood furniture and veneer. That was the difference. Okay, and most of what we're doing now is hardwood furniture. You know, we've got stuff that has depth and legs and research. And there are a couple of things we know that we're doing that aren't quite right. It's like, honestly, we're still playing a decades old North Korea because it's fun when we go to a convention. But if a professional group says, I want you to run North Korea, I'll say no, because I don't have enough information on how the current Korean government works. I can tell you what the bureaucracy looks like, but I can't tell you who's making decisions. I can't tell you all their motivations, or at least a facsimile of them that I'm satisfied with. But you know,
yeah, they really
the
need
model,
to do it.
got it.
They really need to do a sequel to Team America World Police.
Yeah. So one of the other challenges that we have, and I think other people see this, is it's very hard for us to simulate one-party states unless they're highly bureaucratic. I can simulate Russia because there's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of things that parallel the old structure with institutions and people with vested interests, from the railroad magnates to the oil men to the media people. They've divided up the pie in a way you can identify parts and pieces and see who has enough influence to try to convince the boss to do something else until the boss doesn't like it in a major way and he whacks them. Okay. The model we use for Russia now is what I call Politburo 2.0. We advise the boss. You know, because there's a lot of similarities to the way that works.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the three legs of the old system. But, you know, when you try to do a one-party state, like if I try to do Saddam's Iraq, I'm going to have big problems. I don't have enough information on the Ba'ath Party in the period. I don't have enough information on the players. Even with the Iraqi wanted deck, I can't get there in reverse for a historical scenario. You know, you're just not going to do a good job. I mean, there's some places you just can't put in a 4-hour game. We keep talking about how we'd love to do Brazil. I'd love to do Brazil as a simulation, because then I can talk favelas and prisons and institution and family ties and bribery and all kinds, and sugar and you know, and ethanol. And I mean, there's all kinds of great subjects that we could get into it. But the problem is I can't teach it in 4 hours and play it in 4 hours. How do I teach a bunch of Americans how Brazil works in 4 hours? Can't do it. I could maybe do it for an 8-hour game, but they better be dedicated, because how many people will say, I want to play a Brazil game over any other game I can play at your convention or any other game I can have you bring to my school? No. I mean, one of our challenges, we just got back from Culver Academy. And Culver Academy is a private high school for extremely well-heeled families, because the tuition is considerable. And these are all high school students, but they tend to be all high school students that are basically in AP classes. So they get this much about the Cold War. There's like 6 boxes in their book, you know, it talks about mutual assured destruction and this and this and this. And they said they wanted us to run a 2-hour game on the Cold War. Oh my gosh. We had to do a number of things differently and do a lot of different kinds of prep, because we knew we could expose them, their staff, and the facilitators they were going to contribute to our staff, because they wanted a 100-person game in 2 hours that ran multiple countries, that would give students who are mostly ignorant a sense of how it worked. Now, there's all kinds of things I can assume when I even have a pickup game at Gen Con, because most of those people have finished high school, and some of them read the news. And one of the advantages I have of public events is about a third of the audience to 60% of the audience at a particular event are repeat. So the old players train the new players. That helps me a lot.
Yeah,
Um,
and they've self-selected, so they're going to the game they're interested in
right.
already.
And for some students it was mandatory to come, and for some students it was voluntary to come. So we had people go into classrooms we were going to have a first game Friday, second game Saturday. They only wanted two because they had conflicts for other things. So we did a 2-hour game Friday, a 4-hour game Saturday. Saturdays was modern. Okay. We got to go into 4 AP history classes and do presentations on what it was like to be in the Cold War. So I did a whole series where it was like, if you're a Soviet leader in the Cold War, what was your background? Well, you were at meetings and you saw the guy next to you disappear, and you might have gotten instructions to shoot the guy on your left. And if you didn't do it, the guy on your right was supposed to shoot you. And you'll discover that Stalin learned all about memes where he took people out of the picture. Okay. And then we talked about China and we talked about the US. Okay. Who's John F. Kennedy? He's heavily injured. He swims his buddies to the beach on a nearby island. He's a bona fide war hero. All the people in his cabinet pretty much served in the war. So you got that hook, the story to them before they ever came to the game. So 70% of the students got that hook. We had a group of our team go in and talk about Israel and Hamas and Iran and the conflict there and some of the moving parts. Those were a way we helped to socialize players before the game. So we had a 90-minute classroom session with kids, and most of those kids came to the game for a 2-hour game. That helped a lot because it got them into the mindset that we needed them in, even though our in brief was down to 10 minutes. I had to give them bare bones. And then we built some very powerful counterfactuals. So Kennedy survived his assassination, and we simulated Khrushchev's visit to America because we had ringers for Kennedy and ringers for Khrushchev, so the cells would work fairly well to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then we got rid of both of them because Kennedy survived the assassination, but then he dies at Camp David of an overdose because that got them thinking about history in a whole different way. And Khrushchev is getting pushed out because this ignorant farmer who didn't tell anybody he traded for Jupiter missiles in Turkey to get rid of the missiles in Cuba, basically is getting pushed out by everybody who thinks he's a bumpkin and a real troublemaker. While he's in America doing the visit that he actually did in 58, but we had it happen in 63 because that got them a sense of the era. And they had the guy who had playing Khrushchev went in with a Soviet military hat. He went in poking people in the chest. He had to tell a Khrushchev joke. So I had him look up some Khrushchev jokes.
Did he take his shoe off?
No, he didn't. We didn't do the pounding the shoe thing. We really didn't. We were tempted, but we didn't. But the thing is, what you'll find is that even in that environment, you suck people in that magic circle so quickly. But there are things you can't do. A game like that has to be, a 2-hour game is international. You don't have domestic stuff hardly ever. And this was an exception because I built a succession crisis into every country we ran. Because we ran in the UK as well, and the UK had the whole thing with Brown and the transition of power then. We had military stuff. We had like 6 different threads planned if we needed them. We did 3. One was a military lost nuclear device. One was the succession crisis in the different countries. And the other one was, come on, I should remember this, was... I don't remember it right now. I'm losing my mind. It's a long thing. But anyway, but we had a backlog of things that we could use to get people initiated and active. And we went through that, and the 2-hour game worked. But I had to have more staff in my plan. So we actually had more NSDM staffers in one place than ever. We had 16 people show up, 18 had planned. We've never had more than 10, even when we had a staff meeting to talk planning and developing new stuff. And that's really great when you have volunteers because it was good location. They gave us guest house where everybody could have, their air mattresses or have a bed, and we brought in our snacks, and we had a great meeting afterwards on all the things we were going to make better and talked a lot better than we actually are going to do. But, that's the way it is. It was a wonderful experience for them and for us. So we got to do 2-hour game, 4-hour game, may get to go back. But you got to keep in mind, 2 hours are international. 4 hours, you can do some detail. 8 hours, you can do like a decade of gameplay and start dealing with economics and long-range military plans and alliances and things you don't have the time to deal with in the shorter environment. So just like those things needed special adaptation, we also had to adapt to move online. Had we adapted to move to Zoom or Skype or something like that, there's lots of things we would have discarded if that was the only tool. I mean, how long have Discord and Slack been around? Without channels, we would be doing Google Docs and video. And we would probably have timed sessions. You get 10 minutes with your cell controller, and then he disappears for 5 minutes because we all go to a staff meeting to try to figure this out. And then we'll like show videos of duck and cover or something if you're in a 60s game. So you're entertained while we're doing this other thing because we got to do that to make the game move forward. I mean, there are some wacky things you might need to do to make it function when all you've got is video, video meetings and documents. There's some things you might do we could probably play an NSDN game by email, but you'd have a whole day to do your turn, and we do a resolution at night, and then tomorrow you do your next turn. And then we'd come up with some way with like a online forum or web blog where players in different groups could converse over what deals they would needed to make or what bills they needed to pass or something like that. I mean, It would be a very different model from what we're doing now. The real benefit to us, and I can't say enough nice things about the Discord Slack alternative, is it makes it more one-stop shopping. I can put everything there. Everybody can get to it. And if I have a problem, it's an adaptable enough tool. They can do it from any platform. So they're not hardware restricted. They're not software restricted. That is a huge advantage for us.
I think it is. So
anyway, what
I don't have anything else, Merle. Do you have anything else you want to say?
I don't think so, other than to thanks everybody for coming. I hope this has been valuable to me. If you have questions, because you see the video later, put them in Discord. I guarantee they'll get an answer. And I'll put the slide deck out as a PDF so people can see all the fine print and then ask more questions later. I think we're covered.
I'll go ahead and take us out. Thank you very much, Merle.
Thanks, everybody.
The next event in Connections Online will start in about 29 minutes. So the link to that is in the field below. Thank you very much.